So as the political crisis grinds on in Venezuela and without any clear resolution in sight, Maduro seems to be hanging on with the support of the military, but Guaido hasn't surrendered or fled the country yet. So it's not clear exactly what's going to happen. Now, all of the Western powers are still firmly backing Guaido, despite his lack of advancement in the last week. And I think some people in Venezuela are starting to ask what the West's support is really worth. They haven't really done anything overt yet. Now, there could be covert operations going on in the background that we don't know about, but as far as from what we can see in the news, the West has not done anything to help Guaido aside from pontificate in his favor on television and say, oh, Maduro's a bad guy. However, if it comes down to it and Guaido is unable to actually secure any power, which it looks like he really isn't able to get anything done, will the Western powers, specifically the U.S., be willing to intervene militarily on his behalf? Now, he has been calling for that. If you watched my last video on Venezuela, Guaido has been calling for that at least twice in interviews, saying that he would be happy to see the U.S. invade Venezuela to overthrow Maduro. And, of course, President Trump has repeatedly said that all options are on the table with respect to Venezuela. He hasn't said that in the last couple weeks, I don't believe, but he hasn't rescinded his comments. And, of course, John Bolton, his national security advisor, has had Venezuela on his informal list of regimes in need of change for quite some time now, at least back into the Bush administration, in which there was an attempted coup against Chavez back in 2002, I believe. That one was foiled, of course. Now, the House Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing this week on the matter of Venezuela, and it would seem as though that committee, at least, does not think that there is such a thing as a military option currently on the table. Representative Eliot Engel, who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House, said that definitively to all people listening, there is no military option being discussed, and that is not. He seemed pretty firm on that. Now, it is also worth considering that the House, as of this January, is now controlled by the Democrats, so perhaps they might be a little more resistant to President Trump's saber-rattling, as Eliot Engel put it, because they are. It's a little easier when it's someone of the opposite party, but typically when someone of your own party is warmongering, you kind of are obligated to support them in any way possible. Despite that, however, there are plenty of warmongering Democrats in the House who I'm sure would be happy to see the U.S. go to war with Venezuela. So if you took those votes and put them with, all the Republicans who would already support Trump's war, I don't think it would be impossible to get some kind of congressional resolution or declaration through the House. And, of course, the Senate is, of course, controlled by Republicans who love war. So that shouldn't be too difficult either. Of course, in the modern age, congressional votes don't really matter when it comes to war because the Congress hasn't declared a war since World War II. That was the last officially declared war that the U.S. was ever involved in. The rest of them were all, overseas contingency operations, I think is what they call them. Not wars, of course, but, we users of the English language and not legalese call them wars. So, unfortunately, the president does have every ability to invade Venezuela without even speaking to Congress first, and that is granted to him under the War Powers Act, which is of dubious constitutionality, but nevertheless it is in effect, so he can, for up to 90 days, I believe, deploy troops in an area where there is no congressional authorization, and he can engage in a war without a declaration of war. This, for example, is how Obama got his war in Libya. Obama knew that Gaddafi was weak and that it wouldn't take more than 90 days, and he couldn't get anything through Congress, so Obama just went in with France and the UK, and they were able to overthrow Gaddafi pretty quickly. I'm sure that given 90 days, Trump would be able to do quite a bit of damage to Maduro's regime. I don't know if he would be able to successfully overthrow him. A lot of factors that would play into that, his his current popularity, whether people would rally around him because, they're getting bombed by Americans. Where the bombs drop also matters. Given that Elliott Abrams is the man in charge of the U.S.'s positions on Venezuela, I could certainly see a scenario where Trump has a 90-day bombing campaign in Venezuela, and then leaves the rest to Elliott Abrams-trained death squads to clean up the job. That, I think, would not necessarily be a winning strategy, but it is a strategy that they could, that the executive branch could employ without congressional authorization. So, just to review, what that would entail would be bombing of key military targets to try and take out as much of Venezuela's military infrastructure as possible, try and, bomb anywhere where they would have planes or troop barracks or things like that, weapons depots, which I'm sure the U.S. has pretty good intelligence on at this point. I don't think that Venezuela would necessarily hide all that stuff particularly well. And after 90 days, then, and when the bombs stop falling, they can then send in the death squads, which is kind of an old term from the 80s. Basically, the idea of the death squads is the U.S. arms some troops who are of dubious background and allow them to serve as proxies and fight their enemies for them. Now, the death squads typically are not made up of the nicest guys. They're basically mercenaries. And so they do leave a lot of discomfort in their wake. However, now, of course, the death squads was the primary tool used by the Obama administration in Syria, and that hasn't worked out all too well. It has certainly kept Syria destabilized and in a state of violence, but they've not been able to overthrow Assad. So if I had to guess, the operation in Venezuela could go one of two ways. It could go into a state in which they very quickly topple Maduro, and then the country is just sort of left in chaos with no real locus of power, and you go into a prolonged period of civil war like Libya or Somalia, or you have a state in which you end up kind of like Syria, to where there is a locus of power, but there's also a long drawn-out civil war because no one side is really strong enough to assert power over the entire country. And of course, they couldn't divide the country because the U.S. has a very strong policy against partitions. You might remember that from the 90s in Kosovo. There were proposals back then that hey, perhaps Kosovo should just be partitioned between the Serb parts and the Albanian parts, so that the Serb parts could be a part of Serbia and not be a minority in a majority Albanian state. Madeleine Albright was firmly against that. It was about the worst thing that she could imagine, and I think that probably is a has its psychological roots in the U.S. Civil War and how it's drilled into people's heads that secession is synonymous with Satanism, so we can't partition countries. Yeah. So overall, I don't think that Trump is going to necessarily have an easy time getting any sort of authorization of use of military force through the Congress with regard to Venezuela. I think that there's going to be significant pushback. However, it doesn't really matter. He's going to be able to do what he wants either way. The executive in the United States has an incredible amount of power on their own, and they don't really need Congress in order to conduct foreign policy. The president can just about do whatever they want within with very limited constraints. So I will predict at this point that Guaido will not be able to get things done in the country on his own, and it will require an escalation by the U.S. in order for any more developments to occur in this ongoing situation. If you made it this far, please like and subscribe, or maybe comment your thoughts, things that I could do better maybe. I do appreciate it because I am so early on in this. This is still less than a week that I've had the channel up. Gotten pretty good response, I think, so far. Getting a few hits, better than I expected. I was expecting that I'd go like 2 months without anybody ever clicking on a video. That's about it.